All right. Well, I don't think it'll hurt to get us started. So, good evening, folks, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Sam Boss, and I'm chair of Auburn's Conservation Working Group. Over the past few years, we've seen growing public interest in pollinators and the important role that they play in our ecosystems. Last spring, the city of Auburn ran a No Mow May event that encouraged residents to do their part by holding off on mowing their lawns in order to provide food for newly emerging pollinators in the early part of the season. This year, we're looking to build on the success of that campaign by offering activities and workshops that teach you about how you can make your yard a haven for pollinators, as well as birds and other animals that rely on insects as a critical part of their diet. To lead off this series, I'm delighted to welcome Lynne Holland of the Maine Cooperative Extension to present tonight's webinar, Backyard Pollinator Habitats. It's easier than you think. So a little background about Lynne. Lynne coordinates the Master Gardener volunteers for 3 counties, Androscoggin, Saginaw, and Kennebec. She is also part of the Maine Harvest for Hunger team and co-chairs the Pollinator Friendly Garden Project, a collaboration with UNH to certify gardens in both states that model pollinator-friendly biodiversity in the garden. Lynne's education has been intertwined with work experience throughout her career. She has worked in most facets of ornamental horticulture, from growing field flowers for a farm stand to managing floral operations for the largest privately held grocery chain in Texas. So the way this is going to work is Lynne will have time to give her presentation, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So make sure to take note of your questions, and I will share those with Lynne from the Q&A or from the chat. All right, so without further ado, I will turn it over to you. And
thank you, Sam. I'm just going to do my screen share here. While I'm on screen share, it's really hard for me to see the chat or the Q&A. But if somebody has like this urgent burning question, I can see you, Sam. So just kind of give me a wave and I will take a second and take a breath and give you a chance to say something. But otherwise, I'm just going to go through my presentation. It's a presentation that we are using throughout the state this spring to talk about backyard pollinator habitats. We're doing a lot of outreach. We started last year and reached over 1,000 people with this program, but we're really concentrating on it this year. It's based on our Pollinator Friendly Garden certification, and we've certified over 100 gardens between New Hampshire and Maine, and many gardens are actually able to be visited. So when I share the resource for that certification, you'll be able to also see a map there and see gardens that you could actually go and visit. But without further ado, I'm going to get started here. So we've got a couple of learning objectives tonight. The first of which is what is a pollinator habitat? So we're all talking about the same thing and how to get started. And then we're going to review 3 types of gardens: the native pollinator garden, meadows and rewilding, and then rain gardens. So the secret of pollinator habitats or pollinator happiness, well, you can go about learning it a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of folks that promote this. Not the least of which is, a program like you have in your city here in Auburn. But we do have 2 online programs. One is through Brightspace, and the other is our Pollinator Garden Certification Program. Brightspace is a program that the University of Maine uses to do online learning. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, this is a self-driven course. You do it at your own pace, and you can get a micro-credential. And this is basically the basic tenets of pollinator-friendly habitats. Once you've done that, or maybe if you're already an experienced gardener, you could then talk about getting certified for pollinator-friendly certification. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the basis of that program is what I'm going to cover tonight. So why do we want pollinator habitats? Well, one of the biggest reasons is it's going to make our area more adaptable to climate change. It's much more sustainable by design because you're not fighting what's natural. It's very ecologically focused, which is kind of at odds with a lot of the commercial horticulture that you see out there, the things you see on TV about, in the gardening shows where everything is manicured and perfect. Pollinator habitats can be a little messy. You could have a traditional garden and make it pollinator friendly, but it's never going to be like precisely manicured because you need to leave a little bit of the mess out there for the pollinators. One of the great things about pollinator habitats is their year-round interest. And what also makes that important is that means they're also supporting the land year-round as well. So how do you get started? Well, the first thing with any garden is you have to assess your site. You want to reflect on what your personal goals are. If you have 5 acres of land, or if you live in an apartment complex and you have literally a 5x8 area that they let you plant with whatever you want, your goals are going to be different. And then once you realize what your goals are and you know what your site is like, then you can select a garden type that matches that. Doing anything other than that is going to be a fight or a slog the whole way. And you don't want that in gardening. You want gardening to be fun, or you're not going to do it. So what do I mean by assess your site? Well, the first thing is, how much sunlight do you get? And then what's the soil texture? And then what about other qualities of your soil? Is it always wet? Is it dry out so quickly that it's like a little desert out there? Does it turn into concrete when you haven't had water for a few days? Where is that water moving to and from? Do you have a little stream on your land, or is it someplace that you're going to have to always be adding water to? And then look at your other landscape features. Do you already have some trees or shrubs, or perhaps you're gardening on ledge or in what is kind of a mucky area? And then look at existing plants and wildlife. And when you're doing this assessing of your site and you need to kind of think about what does it all mean, take a few minutes to go out into a natural area, sort of like what you would want your garden to look like, and see what's growing there. Because nature is probably your best demonstration garden out there. And what are the biggest challenges with your sites? So I want you to take a minute and put in the chat, not the Q&A, because we don't want to overwhelm Sam here. But if you can, do they have access to the chat, Sam?
I think it's just the Q&A, but that's fine. I can put their questions in and we can both take a look at those. That's no problem.
So I would like you to share some of the challenges that you have. I don't want a full site description. This isn't like a personal consultation, but maybe you have a place that's always mucky, or maybe you have an area that slopes a lot, or maybe you're at the top of a hill. So think about what are the biggest challenges you're facing with your site. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about sunlight. How do you know how much sunlight you're really getting? So think about summertime. We're right now going to be, this first day of spring is today, well, at 11 o'clock tonight. So right now we're looking at basically about 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. However, come the middle of June, we will gain many, many hours of daylight. And some of us will be looking at 14, 16 hours of daylight. How much of that time is full sun on the area where your garden is going to be? You need 6+ hours of full sun, and that sun has to be during basically that middle part of the day from like 9 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. Having 6 hours of daylight starting at 3 in the afternoon and going until sunset isn't going to do you any good. Or having, the sun shining on it at 5 in the morning and then, it's clouded by 11. That's only going to happen for a few weeks in the middle of June. So think about the middle of the day. And if you have 6 hours of sun, that's full sun. Partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, and partial shade is 2 to 4 hours. If you have less than 2 hours of sun in an area, so that means maybe it's in a grove of trees or something like that, and you can't even read a book in how shady of an area it is, you're not going to be able to grow much of a garden. Things will grow there, but they won't necessarily be the type of things that will attract pollinators. And how does that light condition change over time? Sometimes morning sun I find to be the best sun to garden in because it's not super hot generally. So the plants get the sun without getting the drying of the sun that you get, say, in the evening, where 4 o'clock in the afternoon in that area is just like so hard to sit around in. It's just so sunny and so dry. Generally speaking, if you're going to do a vegetable garden, you're going to need 6 hours of direct sunlight. Pollinator gardens are a little bit more forgiving. The next thing I want to do is think about your soil texture. And I know this looks like a complicated graph, and it kind of is. But the reality is one of the sides of the triangle is clay, the other one is silt, and then the bottom is sand. And in general, in Maine, we tend to either have soil that's kind of a clay loam, so it's got a fair amount of clay, a fair amount of silt, and a fair amount of sand. Or it's a sandy loam, or just what they call regular loam, which is like the ideal, where you've got about the same amount of each. The thing about your soil texture is it's going to determine other things about your garden. It's going to determine if it's going to hold water. It's going to have an impact on your pH. And I'll talk very briefly about pH in a minute. But knowing what kind of ground conditions you have is super important, because certain plants grow in certain types of soil, and they grow easily and they grow well. And we're going to be talking mostly about native plants. So chances are, if it's a native plant, it will be able to adapt to the less than perfect situation. But the closer you can get to a perfect situation, which would be a loam, a clay loam, or a sandy clay loam, or a silt loam, anywhere down in this bottom middle, your chances are you'll be successful with most native plants. Now, I mentioned pH briefly, and I don't want to get too sciencey on you, but pH basically is how acid or how basic or alkaline your soil is. Basic and alkaline is the same thing. Things that really love acid soils: strawberries, potatoes, pine trees, rhododendron, they all love acid. And if you have soil like that, those plants will do very well. Other plants will grow in it, but they won't do great. Also, what kind of nutrient levels are in your soil? What kind of other things, other minerals, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus? Those are the basic things that the plant needs to be able to access through its roots in order to grow. How much organic matter is in your soil? If you're literally planting things on ledge or rock, Chances are the answer is not very much. Is there lead in your soil? A lot of the Maine towns and cities that had mills at one point or other industrial activities in the last century have lead in their soil. And if you're growing food, you don't want to grow food in soil that has lead. However, if you're growing ornamentals, the lead isn't really a huge issue. You just don't want anybody eating those ornamentals because lead could actually come up through the leaves and the shoots and the berries or whatever. The best way to find out all this information is to submit a soil sample to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension Soil Lab. And our office in Lisbon Falls has soil tests. I know the city of Auburn, Jennifer Edwards Morin has soil tests in her office. I think that's in the health department. So if you need a soil test, we can get you one. It costs $20, but you probably, if it's an ornamental garden, will only have to do this once. But that'll also probably save you money in the long run because you won't be adding things to your soil that you don't need. You'll know exactly what you need, and then that's all you'll ever have to add. The soil test comes back looking like this. First thing they tell you is your soil pH, 6.1 for this one. 6.5 is really good for most vegetable gardens and quite a few flower gardens. Organic matter, 5.3%. That's about medium. So that's how you read it. You just read it across. That's about medium. You could use some organic matter, but organic matter is like the Band-Aid for soil. If you have too much sand, or add organic matter. You got too much clay, add organic matter. It's just one of those things that really sets the stage for your soil being able to support plants better. Phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are what we call macronutrients or major nutrients. And in this case, you can see in most situations, you're in pretty good shape with this soil test. In fact, you're optimum with magnesium and you're at least medium with everything else. The micronutrients, some of those are a little bit on the low side, and those are probably more important if you're growing certain types of plants. But in general, this soil's in pretty good shape. The other part of that soil test is the recommendations. So they will tell you to raise your soil pH because you're a little low, do this. And in this situation, they're talking about when we did this test, it was for potatoes and other general vegetables, but I'm using it just as an example. It tells you how to raise your soil pH. It tells you what's sufficient, and then it tells you how to add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, because those are the three major nutrients that will come from most fertilizers. And in this situation, it was an organic recommendation because that's what this person wanted. So all of these are organic fertilizers, and so on and so forth, all the way down. So the soil test has a lot of great information on it. Soil also affects the water movement on your soil in your yard, and how that's so important. I mean, we all know what happened back in January in a lot of places where we had flooding. And actually, not that many weeks ago, there were, again, some storms that caused flooding. Flooding can really do damage to soil. It can undermine, supports of things like, your sidewalks, your major trees, things like that. So knowing where water is on your soil and where it's going to is important. Even if you're just planting a plant, you want to know how long it takes for that soil to drain, because the last thing you want to do is plant to plant, fill that that hole up with water, throw a bunch of soil in it and have that plant sit in water for days on end until it drains. That's what a percolation test is. You dig a little hole, you fill it with water, and then see how long it takes to drain. That's going to inform you how to actually plant in the future, knowing how much water to add. Sometimes it means adding the same amount of water, but over a longer period of time. Or if it's draining quickly, it might mean needing more water to have the plant be able to reach that water before it drains away. Slopes, winds, are there walls or fences that you need to be aware of? If anybody here has a house that faces south, you know what happens in your front yard come this time of year. You start seeing green stuff close to the foundation of your house. That foundation of the house is relatively warm compared to the soil temperature. The sun is still fairly far to the south. And so that area becomes like this little microclimate, and it's a little bit ahead, maybe a week or two, than the backyard of your house, which now faces north. My house happens to face north, and I look out across the street at my neighbor. They have daffodils completely up right now. My daffodils, I haven't even broke ground yet. So microclimates can be really important. And they can also be kind of fun. You might be able to grow something that, maybe if you're a zone 4, that is a zone 5 plant, just because you've got the right space to put it. And the last thing is also, is there water nearby? If you're establishing a garden area, you have to be able to get water to it, at least for the first year or so. And although it seems like anything's possible this time of year, by the time you've hauled that watering can or watering bucket for the 14th or 15th time, 500 yards to this beautiful little idyllic space, you're going to be like, why did I put my garden out here? What plants are already growing in that area? And that means, are there existing plants? Is it lawn? Do you have native plants already there? Do you have invasive plants that you've been dealing with? Do you have perennial weeds? Or are there certain things that show up every year that you have to mow down or weed out, like those little maple whirligigs? Know what is going on in your yard before you start trying to change your yard. Do you have regular wildlife sightings? Biodiversity in your yard, even if it's as small as knowing you've got rabbits or groundhogs or squirrels or chipmunks, all indicate certain things about your yard. And certain plants are going to be kind of like candy to wildlife. So maybe as you're establishing those plants, you may have to protect them. Then once they're established, they can kind of fend for themselves. And how will these factors influence your plan? If you don't have a single tree in your yard, but your neighbor's yard overshadows you with pines and oaks, so you never get sunlight, that's going to influence your garden design. Then reflect on your personal goals. How much time do you have to give to this project? What do you hope to achieve? Do you want to grow food? Do you want to relax in your space? Do you want to have a place that you just want to be able to have a beautiful view out your front or your back window? Do you want to attract pollinators? What resources are available to you? A garden is never the same from one day to the next or 1 year to the next. So what are some of your goals, and what are some of the things that will get you to those goals? Because there's going to be a time where you have a bare spot, or maybe a weed shows up that you really need to deal with. And so you can't be put off by, I'm not even call it a setback, just like the little curves in the road. I see a lot of information in the Q&A. So what are your personal goals? I mean, you can throw some of those in the chat, but if it's pollinators, you don't have to mention that because we're going to talk about that, whether that's your goal or not. So the big thing is, how do you bring these two things together, your site assessment and your goals? And that's what I'm going to talk about now, is some of the parts of a garden that will help you achieve that. Consider the type of garden. A native pollinator garden, that would be like a more traditional garden. Pollinator gardens tend to be heavy to perennials, but they can have annuals in them. They also should probably have a few shrubs and maybe some nearby native trees, because that's what's going to be needed to support the pollinators. Rain gardens, that's something you might want to consider if you have an area that tends to be wet, or where water tends to run through it on its way to somewhere else. A rain garden can create an area that it's okay to flood for an hour or two or a day or two, and it will slow down that water on its way to somewhere else. And as you slow down that water, the nutrients that have come out of the soil into that water will then deposit back down into that garden. And meadow or rewilding, if you have a big enough area that you could turn it over to be sort of like on autopilot eventually, that is something to consider if you've got a very large area, or if you have an area that you want a distant view to be seen, you might want to create the nearby area sort of a wild area that you don't do too much. It's not too fussy, and you kind of let nature be the showcase there. For native and pollinator gardens, the big thing for any garden actually is the right plant in the right place. And because it's a pollinator garden, you want to support wildlife, because that's what pollinators are. And pollinators are more than bees. They can be bees, they can be butterflies, they can be bats, they can be other types of insects. There's many things that will spread pollen. Even some mammals tend to get, a little bit of pollen on their nose or their paws or whatever, and spread it around. And of course, birds are also a major part of pollinator gardens, because birds eat caterpillars, or they eat small insects. So your pollinator garden is going to support a lot of wildlife, and diversity is so important in that situation, because if you're only supporting one thing, let's say butterflies, and not supporting anything else like birds, your garden is going to be out of balance. You also want to work with and not against your site. You might want to have this beautiful shaded glen with ferns and trilliums and all sorts of spring flowers that are called ephemerals. They only bloom in spring and then they disappear. But if you live on the top of a hill and it's constantly windy, no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to create that site. So work with your site, work with the strengths of your site, and your gardening will be not only much more enjoyable, it'll be much more successful. So I've mentioned native plants, and basically native plants are the basis of our pollinator-friendly garden, because they're the best way to increase biodiversity in a garden. The thing about native plants is they've evolved here, so they're going to be more resilient. And we do have to deal with the idea of climate change, but it's not necessarily, it's been coming for a while, and there are plants that will be able to deal with the longer, warmer falls that we're seeing, or the shorter, wetter springs that we're seeing. We know what those plants are because there's other places like that in the United States, and we know what grows well there. And we also know what pollinators are there, and the pollinators will eventually find them. That they're always, a native plant is always going to be attractive to a native pollinator. And that's the strength and the resiliency in that garden network. Once established, pollinator gardens tend to be low maintenance. They also tend to be fairly low cost. You're not buying the latest and greatest and newest hybrid. And a lot of those latest and greatest and newest hybrids tend to be kind of expensive. There's been a lot of research put into it. Pollinator gardens can be on poor drainage areas or good drainage areas. Eventually, they're not that picky, but when you first get started, you may have to deal with drainage to a certain extent. You can grow a pollinator garden on almost any kind of soil quality. There are native plants that will survive almost literally growing on rocks or growing in a marsh or mucky areas. And there's native plants that will grow in the full sun to shade. And basically, it's just finding out which ones and planting those as opposed to, as I said before, fighting your site. The first year or two of creating a garden, you're going to want to plan on having to water that garden to get those plants established. But once it's been established, chances are you're never going to have to put a sprinkler out there or add additional water because the native plant will adapt. And they're remarkable in that way, that they know how to adapt to drought conditions, or some of them go into dormancy, or if it's too wet, some of them might actually die back, but then spring back up again. It's super important to always remember that right plant, right place, because that's going to make a big difference in working with that site and not against it. Here's some ideas of some native plants that like full sun and fairly dry conditions. The pale coneflower, which is a very early native plant. Our regular coneflower blooms a little later. So these pale coneflowers will bloom in June. The butterfly weed will bloom in July, as will the regular coneflower. And then the asters are the queens of the fall. And all different asters bloom all fall long. And it's a really great pollinator attractor. Let's say you have full sun, but it's a little bit on the wet side. Our native blue iris will do very well in even wet conditions. And they like full sun, although I'll be honest with you, I've done okay in part shade with some iris, especially if that shade is from a tree that leaves out a little later. So at least in the late spring and early summer, it's not fully leafed out. Mountain mint is one of those plants, and mints are one of those plants in general that if you give them the conditions they like, that not only will they do well, you'll probably never get rid of them. They're gonna be there long after you are. And then goldenrod, which is a solidago. This is not the type of plant that will give you hay fever. It's not ragweed. It's definitely goldenrod or solidago or solidaster, it's sometimes called. And that again is bright and cheery, and you see that basically from probably late August well into October in many areas. If you've only got partial sun, wild strawberries. And if you've got an area where It goes from full sun to partial sun. A lot of times, even in your lawn, you'll see some wild strawberries. You probably see the flowers and you recognize the leaves, but those strawberries get eaten by little animals long before you get to them. They're very tiny, but wild strawberries, if you can find a patch of them and can pick them, they're really delicious too. Blue lobelia. We think of lobelia as that dark blue plant that's in a lot of hanging baskets, but the native lobelia is spiky, not super tall, medium size, but again, it's just a beautiful blue flower. And blue is one of those colors that's a little bit rare in the garden. And then goldenrod, which is another solidago. It's not as frilly and fluffy as the traditional solidago. It's a little bit more airy with the bigger leaves, the longer leaves, but it's a beautiful plant. If you're getting into partial shade or shade, things like foam flower, the flowering raspberry, and then witch hazel is actually a shrub. And kind of uniquely, witch hazel blooms in the fall. Another fall blooming shrub is pea shrub, which is native in some parts of New England. And that is one of those plants that when it goes into bloom, you're just like, what the heck is that? There's like bees buzzing all around it. It literally hums. Plants can be more than just there to produce flowers, though. They can provide hosts in other ways. They can provide food for the insect larvae. So caterpillars are a wonderful, fascinating topic. And if you ever get into them, it's just amazing how resourceful nature is. Caterpillars, depending on the species of insect, might show up in the spring, the summer, or even the fall. Some insects, you'll get 2-3 generations in the source over the course of our season. Others, you might only see one generation. An example where you only see one generation is a brown-tailed moth. I know nobody likes brown-tailed moth, but they do produce caterpillars, and luckily birds will eat their caterpillars. Those caterpillars come out basically late May into late June, and then that's it for the year. Monarch butterflies, those generally produce 1 to 2 generations, depending on where you're located. Generally speaking, you're going to see that caterpillar in August. But there are some insects that will produce 2 or 3 insects, 2 or 3 generations, and those caterpillars are what the birds eat. Generally speaking, native trees and native shrubs support the greatest number of pollinators and other wildlife. And as long as it's a native tree and a native insect, it's going to remain in balance. That brown-tailed moth, that's not native. That's why we're having issues with it, because it doesn't have enough birds that will eat it. So we then, as people, feel the effects of all those extra caterpillars out there. Planting natives and annual plants. As I said, most natives are going to be perennials, but there are some annuals that really do attract a lot of pollinators. And then some of them will reseed themselves. So for instance, butterfly weed, calendula, pale coneflower, purple basil, cosmos, zinnias, and then the common milkweed. They all are plants that literally are annuals. And we all know if you ever had one milkweed in your garden, the next year you probably have 20. So it's reseeding itself. It's not creeping along by roots and growing up somewhere else. It's reseeding itself. Another annual that can reseed itself is the good old sweet alyssum. It's like my favorite little border plant because it does support pollinators. That thing is just literally covered with flowers. Each flower has nectar, and there are certain types of insects that are really attracted by not only the color, but also that nectar, and they produce quite a bit. They move around a lot of pollen. Plants also have to have a right purpose. Some of them provide shelter. Sam mentioned the no-mow May. Sometimes you have pollinators that literally overwinter in your garden. So giving them a place that's protecting them throughout the winter is so important. When the spring gets warm like this year and everybody wants to get out there and rake their lawn and just make it look like a golf course, there's a lot of pollinators that are getting rudely awakened. And then, like it's probably going to happen, I think, what they say, Friday or Saturday, we're going to get a little bit of a cold snap. If you raked up all that duff in your lawn, there's no place for them to hide when it gets cold again. So, if in doubt, just rest, relax, take a minute and decide, does it really need to be cleaned up right now? Some folks, no-mow May works perfect. Other folks, it might be no-mow April and halfway into May. And other folks, in my backyard, I can go right to the middle of June before I even have to worry about cutting my lawn, because honestly, the grass isn't growing that fast, but I have Johnny jump ups, I've got little violas, I've got forget-me-nots, I've got little bluets all growing there. So I'd rather look at them. And then when they start looking a little raggy, maybe middle of June, then we go out there and we mow it, and then we kind of let the grass take over. So now we're going to talk a little bit about rain gardens. And again, you're going to hear me say this over and over again, right plant, right place. The thing about rain gardens is they're made to support water management. And again, if you're working with and not against your site, you're going to not only create a beautiful place of interest and diversity, but you're also probably going to solve a few problems that you've had on your site in the past when there's been a lot of rain. So what is a rain garden? It's a landscape feature where there's a shallow depression in the ground designed to collect the runoff water and slowly filter that water back into the ground with the help of perennials that can tolerate having what I call wet feet, but also tolerate not having wet feet, maybe having a little bit of a dry area during the hottest part of the summer. Why rain gardens? Well, first of all, it's going to help us adapt to climate change. It's also a very sustainable design because it supports the land rather than letting the water undermine the land itself or carrying things off of the land and down the stream. It's ecologically focused. That runoff that comes off of your lawn and eventually ends up in the storm drain and then into the river could be carrying things like too much phosphorus or too much potassium or maybe too much nitrogen. And then that could cause algae blooms or cause areas where the reaction of the plants in those areas get out of balance with the rest of that area. And you could have fish kills, things like that. Rain gardens can create year-round interest, and they can be a problem solver as well. So one of the things about rain gardens is they are going to remove pollutants. And one of the things about dirt or soil that I mentioned before is that it has silt and clay and sand. Sand is a great filter. And if you think about it, something that's made out of clay is almost impervious. So if you're moving your pollutants from an area, say a kind of a clay wet area, into an area where there's more sandy or even rocky soils, you can actually take the things that are in that water, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and when it gets to the place where it can drain a little better, it's going to deposit those in that area. So now you will have removed pollutants from one area, or maybe they're not even pollutants, maybe it's just too much of a good thing, and move it into an area that could really use it. Because again, as the water moves, it tends to take things with it. So this is redirecting that. It filters sediment and slows runoff, which again, after some of the flooding we had earlier this year, slowing down that water makes a big difference. Some of the most impressive pictures was just how fast moving the water was after some of those storms. And what was coming with that water, because it doesn't take much water to move things in the landscape. So if you can slow down water, that's going to be really important. And it helps support diversity because it balances off where that water is. It's not all in one place and not in another. Some garden plants that do well. This is a kind of a collage. This one starting on the right is a red cardinal flower. Good old-fashioned pussy willows. We see them all the time. They do well in the water. Cattails do as well, although cattails can take over an area. So you want to go for, again, a native thing that is not going to get out of balance. This one in the middle here is the button bush. Oh, this one is escaping me. I'll think about it in a minute. I just was looking at that the other day. This is pyrethrum daisy. It's actually feverfew, some folks call it. And then this is a type of mint or a salvia. I can't remember which, but it's a mint of some sort. Or it's not the common milkweed. It might actually be a swamp milkweed. I think that's what that is. The white one, I'll get to it. I'll remember it eventually. When you're looking at plants, you always want to, as I said, know the light requirements, the soil requirements, and the water requirements. And that's usually on the tags. And this is with the time where I say, you don't want to pass around plants from one yard to another unless you know exactly what it is. If you're going to be starting a new garden, you want to start out with at least the plants that you know are the right plants, and maybe have the Latin name for that plant and understand the care for that plant. Pass along plants or plants that are dug out in the wild may or may not be a good idea. And digging plants out in the wild is probably never a good idea for that wild spot you took them out of. So just kind of keep that in mind. Planting seeds you've collected in the wild, that's a different story. But digging plants out of the wild, I would never recommend that. You should always think about how big is this plant going to be when it's mature. And in a rain garden, that's super important, because if the plant is going to outgrow that depression and fill it in, then it won't be a rain garden anymore. So think about the number of plants that might be planted along the edge of that rain garden. And I do have a resource list that I'm going to share with Sam, and he can send it out to those folks that have registered, that has a whole bulletin on how to do a rain garden. But you really want to think about how many plants you're going to put in there and let the garden grow into that space. Companion planting makes sense as well. having plants that grow well together. And I always think about the three sisters. That's not exactly, well, they're actually all native plants, but it's an indigenous planting, they call it a guild, where the plants help each other to be successful. And that was made out of corn, which would grow high, and then the pole beans, which would grow up the corn. So it'd be supported by the corn, and they would create a little bit of shade so that the plant at the bottom, the squash, could get established. And then once that was established, that squash's leaves would shade the ground, which means you would lose less water. So in the true indigenous style, there's no need to do additional watering and or weeding, because when you're shading out the ground, chances are you're not going to get any native annual weeds growing because the seeds won't ever germinate. So let's talk about rewilding a minute. Again, I'm going to repeat myself. Right place, right plant, right plant, right place. Again, in the wild, if you have an area that you just think is beautiful, go on out, take a walk, take a look at that area. Try and figure out what those plants are. Get yourself a good either a guidebook like a wildflower guide, or just grab your camera and go to Google Lens and take a close-up picture of that plant, and chances are they will tell you what that plant is. If it's growing in the wild and it's beautiful and it's not taken over that whole place, chances are it's going to be okay in your garden. If it's an invasive plant, you're going to see imbalance in that area. You know, too much of a good thing is too much. Rewilding, it is very resilient because it will take that space through all three growing seasons, and there'll always be something in bloom. And again, work with, not against your site. This picture here was actually taken at one of the certified pollinator friendly gardens. It's the Langlaw Sculpture Garden, which is, I think it's up in the mid-coast area around Rockland or Camden or somewhere up that way. It's on our map. And this is actually a photo from the garden. And if you take a look, you're going to see, in addition to, there's a lot of asters. This is a fall plant, fall time picture, but you can see there are some bugs and some insects and some grasses there, but you don't see any one thing taking it over. It's really a beautiful garden. When you rewild, you create a landscape where there's a focus on returning the land to its original conditions. It can be removing barriers or adding to that site. It could mean removal of lawn, or adding native trees and shrubs and creating a meadow. And rewilding can be full sun, it could be shade, it could be everything in between. Why would you want to do this? Well, if you've got a large area of land that you need to take care of, that you are stewarding, that's going to help it adapt to climate change. It's going to be a very sustainable situation. It's going to help the ecology of the area. It's going to be very interesting year round. And it also is a problem solver. Who hasn't seen this site when you walked in the woods in the early spring, where you've got what we call our keystone plants? Most of them are trees and shrubs. And then you have that lower layer, that lower level of the garden. So you've got, your very tall trees, you've got a few shrubs and that intermediate layer. And then down in here, if you start looking, you find that there's all kinds of diversity in plant life and in animal life. it's in balance. Woody plants tend to be great host plants and provide food for a lot of caterpillars, which then provide food for birds, and which then provide food for predators, which might be other birds or mammals. Bloodroot is one of those understory plants, blooms in the springtime. If you miss it, like if you're gone for 3 weeks in the middle of spring, you might miss it completely, but it's a beautiful plant that also supports lots of pollinators. All that yellow you see here is pollen, and then down in the middle there, that's full of nectar for butterflies that might be just coming up from their spring migration. Certain plants are iconic in the landscape, and they give the planting a sense of place. I mean, right now we're coming up on Maple Week and Maple Sunday. That's an iconic plant in our landscape. Certain plants are just what you think of when you think of spring in Maine or fall in Maine or summer in Maine. The lupins that you think of probably are not the native lupins, but native lupins were a late spring, early summer plant for millennia. Unfortunately, the invasive lupin has kind of pushed them out. Native plants are pollinator superfoods, and there's about 1,500 of them to choose from. So you're never going to be having lack of choice. Maybe finding them might be the trouble. But once you figure out what you're looking for, if you're patient and you're willing to do some seed starting, you're going to find you have way more plants available to you than you ever thought. A meadow is a good option for a large space, especially if you want to be able to see a distant vista. This QR code, if you take a picture, it will take you to a really great resource done by the University of New Hampshire. It was a federal project about 5 years ago, and they are the go-to resource for meadows in New England. The meadows that they talk about are mostly native plants, but they're not afraid to have other plants in there as well, because we've found that, having a diversity of plants, native, non-native, shrubs, trees, grasses, all of that is going to build diversity in your garden or your garden area. Plants are part of the food system, as are insects, and then so on and so forth, the birds, etc. Pollen is the thing that kind of makes the world go round. Pollen is important in production of food. About 70% of the food you eat had to be part of a pollinated plant in order for it to survive. Summer is generally when people think about meadows, you picture that, summer meadow, but also fall is a great time for meadows. And a meadow generally means it's probably not going to be someplace you fuss with. Maybe you mow it once every couple of years, but other than that, there's not a lot to do with a meadow once you've established it. Generally speaking, late summer blooms, things like Monarda and the daisy-like coneflower. The frilly one here is the Monarda. This is the coneflower. Those are really typical late summer perennials in both meadows and in traditional landscapes. Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan. This one happens to be a green-eyed Susan. But basically, Rudbeckia are another plant that you see a lot of in this kind of a wilder landscape. They have a lot of diversity in color as well. Swamp milkweed is one of those things that attracts the monarch butterflies, but also other butterflies as well. Getting ready to take your questions, Sam. Don't worry. New York ironweed is kind of like one of those things we don't see a lot of, but I think we'll see more of. It is native to New York, but we're finding that it's moving east and north very happily with the changing of the climate. Joe Pyeweed is another one. Both New York ironweed and Joe Pyeweed are very tall plants. And then, of course, I mentioned several times, you've got your New England asters, your solid asters. Asters are just such a lovely addition to any wild area. What about non-native plants? If they have a purpose, if they can tick off a couple of different boxes, it's okay to bring in the non-natives. If they bloom when pollen is scarce, think about like daffodils and tulips are blooming, at a time when not much else is. If they're food for your beneficial buddies, your beneficial insects, or if they serve as shelter or meet some other need, then by all means include them. What you want to do though is try and preserve balance, because once things start getting out of balance is when you run into trouble. So annuals are great late summer until frost. Annuals tend to do better if they are fussed with a little bit. You deadhead them back and they bloom again. A lot of perennials only bloom once, or maybe at the most they might get a second smaller flush. So being able to have them rebloom, which is what an annual does, until an annual starts going to seed, it's going to keep producing flowers. So as you pinch it back or deadhead it, you're convincing that plant to produce more flowers. Pollen and fragrance are two things that is going to attract pollinators. Oops. And you always want to think about your garden with that in mind. And a lot of herbs produce both. The leaves themselves tend to be fragrant, but the flowers also tend to have a lot of fragrance or a lot of pollen to them. When you're thinking about creating a meadow and rewilding, you're going to do really high inputs in the beginning, but soil quality is not super important. Good drainage is important in the beginning, and full sun is pretty much essential unless you're doing a woodland garden. And then you're going to want water nearby. But then once it gets established, you don't have to do a lot of it. There's on that UNH site, there's actually a flowering chart that will tell you what flowers when, so that you can have something flowering each time of the year, spring, summer, and fall. If you're starting a garden, don't think just by, if you want a meadow, you just stop cutting your lawn. That's not going to work. You're going to literally have to take it down to bare ground, which if you think about it, starting last fall would have been the best time. You could have covered it all winter and then take that cardboard or the silage tarp or whatever you use to cover it. And now you've got pretty much bare ground, and that's a good place to start seeds. I always recommend, if you're doing a meadow, to also consider small shrubs. They're going to help you get a foothold and hold that ground until the other stuff gets established. And things like, wild blueberries, wild cranberry, a lot of the smaller subshrubs or large perennials like the Joe Pye weeds and the ironweeds, New York ironweed, can really hold a lot of soil and keep that site from getting taken over by grasses or invasive plants. So which garden is right for you? If you want to throw in the chat what you're thinking about, I'm about ready to take questions, Sam. And sometimes it's not one type of garden. Sometimes it might be a combination of gardens styles to fit your site. Thank
All
you.
right.
I'm ready.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was really great. Just covered a ton of ground there in a pretty short time. So we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. There were a lot of great questions that came up in the chat, and I'm going to try because a lot of them are similar. I'll try to combine some of them. So
Okay.
one of them that came up quite a bit was, different soil conditions. How do I deal with this shady spot or this slope or this sandy soil? And you mentioned that you have some resources for that. And I would be curious, do you ever do consultations? If somebody has a specific situation, they'd like advice from the cooperative extension, do you offer advice on that? Can you help folks kind of plan their gardens?
We really don't have the capacity to do that. I literally cover 3 counties. However, we do have in those situations where you might be working, say, with a municipality or with a school, or maybe there's a library or town hall or something like that. We do have master gardeners who will work on projects and they become your resource. We also have a home garden answer team. So if you have a very specific, kind of like a tricky question, I've got this, but I need to do that. We've got a home garden answer team that you can send a very specific question to. If you want to design an entire garden, either you become the expert or hire an expert. And there's lots of books out there, and there's no one way to do it. And sometimes half the fun is making the mistakes. So also consider that. If you want to ask a question to our home garden team, the email address is homegarden@maine.edu.
Great. Thank you. Another kind of related question that I think affects a lot of people from year to year. If I think about my garden, 2 years ago, I had real issues with drought. The same location had real issues with moisture last year. So if you're planning ahead and you're trying to design your garden to accommodate the shifts that we've had with climate change, what would you suggest to give people the best chance of success for that?
So that's a great example because we literally had 3 years of drought and then like we drowned last summer. And, those shifts were pretty dramatic and traumatic for plants. I think knowing what your soil is tending to do can help you perhaps deal with it as soon as you recognize a problem is about to begin. So for instance, that area that had drought, it wasn't drought because the water was flowing away. It was drought because we didn't have any water that we added. So knowing that you need to add water if you're not getting 1 inch of rain a week, no matter what your soil is, those plants need 1 inch of water a week. So making sure you're on top of that. Maybe you keep a little rain gauge in a garden area so you know how much water is really getting there. I share, it's a very small yard with another person during the summertime at my little cottage by the lake. And we have our rain gauge. She's from Colorado. So she's like, oh my God, there's a whole inch of rain in there. And I'm like, oh, all we had was an inch of rain. So you've got to kind of be not thinking from your point of view, but think about the plant's point of view. We got an inch of rain, we're good. We only had a half an inch of rain. I better get out there and water that planter where I planted this new plant that I really don't want to die.
Got it. So my next question kind of combines a couple of things. So people mentioned they had issues with invasives, and they also mentioned that they had issues with toxins. So sort of the bad stuff that we don't want in our gardens. Do you have suggestions for how to deal with those two things? If you have bittersweet or if you have knotweed that just keeps cropping up like I do in my garden, is there anything you can do, or do you just have to keep after it?
Well, part of it is you have to keep after it. And if it's not weed, Sam, there's a class coming up from Mary Meeting Adult Ed on how to cook with knotweed. You might want to take that. A lot of times when you have problems with whether it's a invasive plant or an invasive pest. It's because they're more persistent than you are. So I think about like knotweed and bittersweet. If you kept out there every 3 weeks cutting it down, year one, you would not see very many, you would not see much knotweed and you would not see much but bittersweet, but you would have to be out there literally every 3 weeks cutting it back. The next year, if you did that, you probably would only have to do it every 4 or 5 weeks. And you would find that that's what we call a perennial invasive weed. You're weakening its roots. And I know a lot of people don't want to deal with chemicals and pesticides, and I'm not in any way saying that's what you have to do. But if you're willing to be judicious about, say, with a bittersweet vine, cutting it down religiously, and I mean like you cut the big thick one that's growing up the tree at the beginning of the summer, and then every 3 weeks cut anything that sprouts from it, and then around the end of August you paint Roundup or glyphosate on that stump. That glyphosate will go down into the roots of that plant, because that's what the plant wants to do in August or September, is take things down into its roots to make it survive the winter. Well, you've tricked it. You're actually sending poison into its roots. You're not sending poison into the soil because you're painting it on the stem. If you're not willing to do that, then you're going to probably be doing that for 4 or 5 years. If you're willing to do like judicious herbicide treatments, you might be able by the 3rd year to not have any come up or have very little come up. Certain invasives, the reason they're invasive is because they can just outlast us. It's a fact. There are some invasive trees that I'm not going to tell you to cut down all your Norway maples, but I am going to say if you have a Norway maple, make sure you're out there during this time of year when the whirligigs are. Even if you don't like clean up all your lawn clippings any other time of the year, use your bag, your lawnmower bag that time of year to get all those little whirligigs up, because there'll be that many fewer Norway maples in the area.
Yeah, that's definitely a project that I have on my to-do list for the spring, because I have a lot of Norway maples to deal with. So I think we should probably wrap it up there, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with us, Lynn. And I will have Liz Allen from the city of Auburn post resources from the Cooperative Extension, some of the information that you had mentioned to the city website, to our Conservation Working Group page. I would also like to invite folks, if you enjoyed this talk and you'd be interested in joining us for other activities, we have our Earth Day cleanup coming up on April 22nd. That's a Saturday, and we'll have more information about that. We're also hoping to give out some native seeds and seedlings. So that's a little incentive to get you out there to help out with that. We're also always taking new members too. So we would love to have folks who enjoyed this talk come and help us out with the Conservation Working Group. Go ahead, Lynn.
So who should I send those resources to? It's a PDF, so.
If you just send them to me, I can share them with Liz and we can get that posted to our website.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Sam, I'll jump in real quick and say that folks have until the end of March to apply for the City of Auburn's Victory Garden grant program. It's a voucher. It's open to any Auburn resident who wants to get started on a garden or buy supplies. You can get up to $150 to at a few select local retailers. So it's a great program. Go to auburnmaine.gov and find that application.
It's great. Thank you, Liz. All right. Well, thank you again, Lynn, and we'll look forward to having future events like this and staying in touch about pollinator gardens.
Great. And anybody who wants to apply, just let me know. We look at gardens all year round. through the Pollinator Friendly Certification Program.
All right. Thanks again.
Take
Take care,
care.
everyone.